Well, thank you, Reed. Good morning, everybody. As Reed mentioned, I'm here to release the latest annual Human Rights Watch World Report. This is a volume that we produce every year, this year covering events in about 90 countries around the world. And we look not only at domestic developments in those countries, but also what the international community has done to try to redress the serious human rights violations that we describe here. Before I launch into the substance of the report, I just wanted to draw your attention to just the beginning of the acknowledgments. This report is dedicated to our beloved colleague, our very respected friend, Ian Gorvin, who died earlier this year after a very long illness. We dedicate this report in particular because Ian was the principal editor of it for a good part of the last decade. And so it seemed an appropriate way to pay tribute to a man who we all miss very, very much. And I'm very pleased that his partner, Roberto Salvatore, and his parents, Janice and Lester Gorvin, are with us today. And thank you very much for joining us. And we're very sorry at the loss. The report covers the current situation in about 90 countries and territories. And let me begin just by outlining some of the more serious situations that are covered in the report. I won't dwell on these, but I do just want to mention them. These include the continuing retrenchment in China, the trend begun in the pre-Beijing Olympics period that continues very much to this day, the electoral charade in Burma, and the repression that continued there as the military tried to reinvent itself as a supposed elected government. The intensified crackdowns in places like Iran or Belarus, the highly repressive closed societies in places like North Korea, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Cuba, the failure to arrest war crime suspects in places like Sudan, where obviously Omar al-Bashir remains at large, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Bosco Ntaganda, an indicted war crime suspect by the ICC, continues in a command position within the Congolese army, and obviously Joseph Kony, the Lord's Resistance Army commander, continues to wreak havoc in northeastern Congo and surrounding states. We highlight the fact that economic development in a country is not an excuse for repression, despite the efforts of, say, Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia or Paul Kagame in Rwanda to justify their repressive rule simply in terms of economic developments in their country. We highlight the refusal to accept electoral losses in places like Zimbabwe and the Cote d'Ivoire, blocked efforts at accountability for serious war crimes in places like Sri Lanka, as well as on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza of a couple of years ago. We highlight the continued detention without trial at Guantanamo, President Obama's unwillingness and inability to close that facility despite early promises in his administration to do so, as well as the US government's failure to prosecute the leading members of the Bush administration who basically have admitted to ordering torture. And finally, we highlight problems here in Europe, the summary expulsion of asylum seekers without giving them the basic procedural rights that they need to avoid renewed repression and persecution, and the growing intolerance and xenophobia in parts of Europe toward migrants, Muslims, Roma, and others. So those are among the highlights of the report. What I wanted to do is take a moment and describe an overall trend that we have noticed as we kind of look around the world. Last year's World Report highlighted a pattern that we noticed in which abusive governments were cracking down on human rights institutions. They were jailing human rights defenders. They were restricting human rights NGOs. They were attacking international justice institutions. This year, we're focusing on what you might call the flip side of the problem. We're focusing on the traditional defenders of human rights, governments that purport to promote human rights in their foreign policies. And what we found is an unfortunate tendency by these governments to fall for some of the subterfuges used by abusive governments to avoid pressure on their human rights record. We are releasing the report for the first time here in Brussels, as Reid mentioned, because, I'm sorry to report, the European Union has epitomized this failure, this tendency to fall for the subterfuge used by abusive governments to avoid serious pressure. Let me explain what I mean. There is a certain rationality to the violation of human rights. By that I mean your typical abusive leader does a cost-benefit analysis, and he determines that the advantages of repression in terms of shutting down the opposition or avoiding challenges to his rule are worth the costs in terms of reputation, in terms of economic costs, in terms of pressure from the international community. A dictator will weigh this cost-benefit analysis and decide that repression pays in his view. Now, the aim of the international community is to make repression not pay, to raise the cost of human rights violations sufficiently so that a rational dictator will realize that he has to allow some basic freedoms. As you would expect, abusive governments push back. They don't want to have to face that kind of pressure. They want the cost-benefit analysis to continue to tip in the direction of repression. And the latest technique they have used to try to resist this kind of pressure is to claim a preference for dialogue and cooperation about human rights. In an extreme version of this, the UN Human Rights Council has actually come to the point where it hardly ever will adopt a resolution about a particular country without that country's consent. And you can imagine how tough those resolutions tend to be when the target has to sign off on it. Or another example closer to home, Catherine Ashton, the EU High Representative, who came to office trumpeting quiet diplomacy as the preferred method for dealing with any problem. When it came time for the EU to take a stand on a proposal to establish a commission of inquiry to look into the years and years of war crimes committed by both sides in the Burmese conflict, she said, ideally we should aim at ensuring a measure of cooperation from the national authorities to explain why a forceful approach like a commission of inquiry was inappropriate. Now, I should say that in principle there is nothing wrong with dialogue and cooperation. By all means, we encourage governments to talk with each other about human rights. We encourage cooperation to achieve better respect for human rights. The problem comes when dialogue and cooperation is the exclusive choice for governments that lack the will to respect human rights. That is, if a government has taken the political decision to respect human rights and simply lacks the means or the know-how or the technical ability, then by all means, talk with it quietly about how to improve its human rights practices, provide experts who can give guidance, provide money to help it build institutions. That's all very appropriate. But when a government lacks the political will to respect human rights, when it's determined to continue repression as a way of clinging to power, dialogue and cooperation alone are never the appropriate response. What's needed is pressure so that the government changes its cost-benefit analysis and is more likely to tip away from repression. Now, why have so many Western governments settled for only dialogue and cooperation when it comes to confronting abusive governments? There are a number of reasons. A lot of it comes down to simply a crisis in confidence on behalf of a number of the major Western governments. They see the shifting balance of power around the world, particularly the rise of China. They confront a deteriorating economy, greater competition for resources. They, in a sense, have been silenced or impeded by their own abuses, particularly in the realm of counterterrorism. And all of this makes a number of Western governments less confident in talking about human rights than they might have been a number of years ago. But of course, there are other more prosaic matters at heart, too. Often the repressive government also has something that the Western government wants. It could be markets, it could be resources, and those also make governments that are in principle committed to promote human rights more reluctant to do so in a meaningful way. Now, I should say that this is a particularly inopportune moment for the defenders of human rights to lose their voice, because the opponents of human rights enforcement have had no qualms about using theirs. We have seen over the last year a number of very direct challenges to basic principles of human rights. For example, people trumpeting the Chinese model of development, as if economic development without political freedom is a viable option for most governments. We've seen challenges to international justice, with many African governments attacking the International Criminal Court because it principally has been focusing on African abuses to this point. We see Sri Lanka and its highly abusive counterinsurgency strategy, the indiscriminate warfare that it committed during the final days of its fight with the Tamil Tigers. We see that kind of scorched earth warfare trumpeted as a model, an alternative to a counterinsurgency doctrine that pays greater respect to the Geneva Conventions, to international humanitarian law, as a better way to gain the respect of the population needed to more definitively confront an insurgency. So we see these kinds of theoretical, if you will, attacks on human rights. We also see much more concrete attacks. China, for example, trying to censor the UN report that found Chinese arms in Darfur, Chinese bullets, despite an arms embargo there. We see Sri Lanka actively fighting against efforts to hold its military and political leaders to account for the war crimes committed in the final days of the fight against the Tamil Tigers. We see China attacking Norway and other European countries because Liu Xiaobo was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and many governments quite rightly sent their ambassador there to celebrate this important award. So this is not a good moment for the West to be suddenly closing the door and talking only behind closed doors about human rights. Now, I should say one of the favorite ploys of those who prefer dialogue and cooperation as the sole response to repression has been to establish formal intergovernmental dialogues between the promoter of human rights and the abuse of government. This, for example, is very frequent by many governments in Europe and North America with respect to China, with respect to the governments of Central Asia, with respect to Russia. The targeted government, the abusive government, loves these kinds of dialogues. It's a great way to make sure that human rights are discussed only behind closed doors. It confines the conversation to mid-level diplomats within the foreign ministry, keeping the matter away from the ministries that are actually involved in human rights abuse, keeping the matter out of the limelight, and keeping the matter away from any kind of public pressure. Unfortunately, the governments that purport to promote human rights also love this kind of private dialogue because it's a way to compartmentalize human rights. It's a way to pretend that they're doing something about human rights, to tell the public, oh, we have a dialogue. What do you mean we're not worried about human rights? But at the same time, to promote human rights in a way that doesn't cost them anything. It doesn't put in any way at risk their relations with the abusive government. It doesn't really force them to spend political capital as they supposedly promote human rights. Indeed, these kind of dialogues often become an end in themselves. The abusive governments have figured out that the governments that supposedly promote human rights, that they are so wedded to these dialogues as a way of avoiding more meaningful forms of pressure, that you actually find abusive governments shutting down the dialogue and then opening them up as if it's a big concession, knowing that the Western government will applaud that ploy because they really don't want to go anywhere beyond the dialogue, but they need the dialogue in order to tell their publics that they're doing something about human rights. Now, what would make these kinds of dialogues much more significant is if benchmarks were attached to them. Clear benchmarks about what the goals of the dialogue are, what concretely the government in question is supposed to accomplish after a period of time following the dialogue. And so the next time the governments get together, there could be measurement against those benchmarks. The participants would be held publicly accountable. This would, really add teeth to the dialogue. It would make an empty exercise much more meaningful. But of course, the point of the dialogue is not to be meaningful. The point of the dialogue is to pretend to be doing something about human rights without spending too much political capital. So you find the European Union, for example, opposing efforts to create benchmarks because it says that that would undermine the confidence-building exercise of the dialogue. As if the point of the dialogue were to generate warm and fuzzy feelings among the participants rather than actually to get something done on behalf of human rights. To make matters worse, when benchmarks have been established, there's a tendency to simply ignore them. We see this, for example, in the way that the EU is approaching Turkmenistan, where they are proposing a partnership and cooperation agreement. And as you all know, the standard Article 2 in a partnership and cooperation agreement says that the governments in question must respect democracy and human rights. There is no way in the world that any honest assessment of Turkmenistan could say that those requirements are met. And so the EU is proposing to enter into an agreement that would be violated from the outset. And it blithely goes ahead as if that's business as usual. A perfect illustration of benchmarks ignored is occurring today with Uzbek President Karimov's visit and his meeting with Mr. Barroso. I think, as you all know, the EU, following the Andijan massacre of 2005, imposed very tough sanctions against Uzbekistan with clear benchmarks requiring an independent investigation into the Andijan massacre, and benchmarks having to do with the repression of civil society. To the great shame of the European Union, led very much by Germany in this respect, it gradually lifted those sanctions, with Uzbekistan having done nothing to satisfy the benchmarks. And indeed, Mr. Karimov's visit today, and it's difficult to conceive of a more ruthless leader around the world than Mr. Karimov, for him to be received warmly by Mr. Barroso is, in a sense, a culmination of this gradual capitulation to Uzbekistan and the ignoring of the principles that at one point stood behind the EU's firm response to the Andijan massacre. It's a shameful moment. I hope that Mr. Barroso will make up for it by at least publicly pronouncing on the ongoing severe repression in Uzbekistan. I hope he will not play games with us by pointing to supposed improvements in Uzbekistan's record, the adoption of habeas corpus that has had no meaningful difference in curtailing the systematic torture, or for that matter, the moratorium on the death penalty, which actually preceded the EU sanctions, in no sense can be attributed to those EU sanctions. But we'll see what Mr. Barroso does. We'll be watching that closely. Another benchmark or set of benchmarks that were simply ignored by the European Union were the benchmarks for Serbia before it could begin formal accession negotiations with the European Union. As you all know, one of the key requirements was that Serbia surrender Ratko Mladic, the former Bosnian Serb military commander who, among other things, has been charged with genocide for the massacre at Srebrenica. Serbia has not turned over Mladic. Nonetheless, the EU announced that those conversations would go forward. Now, I should stress that it's not just the European Union that is the offender here. I've got a long list of comparable things that the US government has done, and many of those are highlighted in the report. One I can just quickly highlight is the US response to Mexico. There is something called the Merida Initiative, which was supposed to condition a certain percentage of US military aid to Mexico on the Mexican military subjecting itself to civilian jurisdiction. Currently, there is exclusively military jurisdiction over abuses committed by the military as it's deployed in the drug war along the northern border. The US government twice now has certified completely against reality that Mexico has met those Merida conditions and has allowed the aid to go forward. The US version of cooperation usually arises when the military claims that by rubbing shoulders with an abusive military, it can get them to behave better. So rather than putting pressure on a military, the Pentagon says, oh, if we can just have closer relations with that military, we can improve their human rights practices. That's the American version of dialogue. And we saw that over the last year where the US resumed military assistance to Kopassus, the Indonesia security force that has been responsible for terrible atrocities over the year and has done virtually nothing to bring those authors to account, and nonetheless the US resumed military aid. We see a similar attitude on the part of the US government toward Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, again, key countries with respect to the conflict in Afghanistan, providing a real incentive for the military to ignore repression there. We also saw it with a new law in the United States prohibiting military aid to governments that use child soldiers. And this year, the Obama administration admitted that a number of countries continued to use child soldiers, but yet it continued military aid to several of those countries, including Yemen and the Democratic Republic of Congo, again, offering as an excuse that engagement was going to be better than pressure. In conclusion, let me just say that we believe that we need a much more honest approach to when cooperation and dialogue works and when it does not work. There are times, as I mentioned, when it's perfectly appropriate, but too often in situations when it's not appropriate, it nonetheless is the sole remedy that is being proposed. There's no question that promoting human rights can often be inconvenient for the governments that purport to do so. But it's better to be honest about not promoting human rights and to pay the public price that would be involved than to use the subject of quiet dialogue and cooperation when we know that it's not going to get anything done. In the meantime, the public should stop letting its leaders get away with this charade. They should insist on a real response to repression rather than the pseudo-response represented by these kinds of quiet exchanges that today characterize the typical response. Now, if the European Union in particular wants to be more serious about its response to repression, there are a number of things that it could do. First, as I mentioned, dialogue would be much more significant if accompanied by benchmarks. That certainly is the case for China, for Russia, for the Central European governments. Second, we're all aware that Catherine Ashton makes countless for-the-record statements. And I don't deny that there's a sort of a regular deluge of statements coming out of her office. That is not enough. That is, if those statements are to be meaningful, they need to be backed by the governments, by the 27 that make up the European Union. For example, the foreign ministers could get together and reaffirm her statement. That would be very significant. You could have individual member states send their foreign minister to reiterate the message that comes from Ashton's office. You could enlist groups of EU members who would provide some continuity to the EU response. So, for example, setting up a permanent troika to deal with Tunisia or to deal with Kyrgyzstan, so that you don't have a sort of a continuing rotation of different troikas every 6 months who are kind of finding out where the country is on the map, and suddenly it's time for them to leave. To establish a kind of a permanent commitment, building on the EU's expertise, asking, for example, Poland and Romania, who have had similar experiences, to be the front countries on Tunisia, asking the powerful countries to focus on a place like Uzbekistan. That would provide real teeth to what Catherine Ashton's office sometimes does. So we don't pretend that the EU never says anything. But we're not fooled by the kind of the flurry of paper, and we understand the difference between a mere statement and a strategy. And our bottom line is that for each country with serious problems around the world, we would like to see a serious strategy emerging from the European Union, one that may certainly include dialogue and cooperation, but one that should not stop there when the problems are political will, and the need is for pressure to develop the political will to respect human rights. Dialogue and cooperation have their place, but they're not the same thing as a strategy. Thank you very much, and I'd welcome your questions.
I'd like to know if you see any difference in the approach of the European Union to human rights today, if you compare the situation to your previous reports, and if you think that human rights are given the required importance in this system and service. Sorry. And the second question, I'd like to know if you can comment on the situation, the position of the European Union on Tunisia before and after this revolution. Thanks.
Okay, well, in terms of the External Action Service, it's obviously just getting going, and Ashton has spent a lot of the last year putting people in place. We have been encouraged by the quality of a number of her appointments, but it really is too early, I think, to say how the service is going to operate, because it's just getting started. We are worried about the philosophy that Ashton brings in to her governance of the service. And if it's a philosophy that focuses exclusively on quiet dialogue and cooperation, it will not make the most of the significant influence that the European Union has. We do see great potential in a more unified European voice. I think one of the problems we've had is that when policy has had to be set by 27 by consensus, it tends to be slow and watered down. We are hopeful that the Lisbon improvements will lead to a stronger EU foreign policy or external policy. But a lot is going to depend on how Ashton chooses to use the service, and second, really, how the governments back it up. If the member states now pretend that they don't need foreign policies, that whatever Ashton does is enough, that is going to be a net loss to the influence of the European Union. What we hope will happen is that Ashton will lead, will set the path, but that she will then be backed by foreign ministers who will reaffirm her statements. We'd like to see a permanent representative body in Brussels on human rights. Currently, the so-called COHOM just meets once a month here in Brussels, which means that they can deal with sort of set-piece events, predictable events, but they can't respond to crises. We'd like to see a permanent body here in Brussels that can meet on a regular basis, on a moment's notice, to make human rights a more serious part of EU external policy. And then, as I mentioned, we'd like to see the governments, the assignment of particular governments, of troikas, if you will, who would be tasked with following up and providing continuity with respect to particular countries. Another way to do that would be by creating special representatives for human rights that would again give a sort of a higher thematic role for human rights than currently exists within the structure that Ashton is creating. Now, as for Tunisia, I mean, the European Union clearly was not ahead of these events. And indeed, although I don't know that anybody was, I don't think that the EU is solely at fault there. We were particularly disappointed by France's response, where, until Ben Ali was basically out the door, it seemed to be more concerned with reinforcing the Tunisian police response than with standing behind the protesters in the street. And here I've got to say the U.S. did a better job because even though it was late getting to the game, it seemed to realize at least a few days earlier than France that this was something significant, and Obama clearly aligned himself with those seeking democracy rather than the corrupt dictatorship hanging on.
Thanks. Oliver Grimm for the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. In light of the things we've been recently seeing in the Ukraine, Belarus, Albania, and so forth on the fringes of the European Union, would you argue that this development makes a hash of the European neighborhood policy, and particularly then also the Eastern Partnership? And in light of the things that are happening, would you rather be in favor of scrapping these policy entirely and starting afresh? Or do you think that these policies could be sort of reformed and remodeled and reshaped in a more sort of useful and productive way? Thank you.
I mean, if you look historically, the European Union has been at its best in promoting human rights when it has come to, say, the accession countries. And if you look at the very substantial changes that occurred in Eastern Europe through the accession process, that shows that meaningful conditionality can make an enormous difference. Now, obviously, the neighborhood policy is one removed, and these days, the focus on those countries seems to be much less the prospect that ultimately they might join the European Union than the view that they are sort of, part of the front line to prevent immigrants from reaching the European Union. And so, for example, we've been deeply concerned by the fact that asylum seekers are summarily returned to Ukraine as if that's a safe third country, when in fact Ukraine is completely incapable, has shown itself incapable of providing fair treatment or any kind of procedural mechanism for those seeking asylum. So I think it's important that this Fortress Europe mentality not be the main way of dealing with governments sort of the next line out. That's been a problem with Ukraine. It's been a problem with Libya. On Belarus, the European Union has been strong recently in condemning Lukashenko's repression. And they were outspoken about the very compromised elections that took place, and strong since then in denouncing his severe crackdown. It's important not to look at countries like Belarus or Ukraine simply in terms of a competition with Russia. Because if that's all that's at stake, then obviously human rights is thrown out the door, because Russia will always do a better job of cozying up to a dictator than the European Union does. And the European Union needs to, I think, be principled in its engagement, recognizing that these states have their own reasons for wanting to be close to the West. And the West should not give up its basic principles in what is sometimes seen as a competition with Russia.
Thank you. Jorge Valero, del diario español La Razón. I have two questions. Going back to the Tunisia topic, would you say that things could be different in Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria and other countries if the European Union will include a sentence saying that they support the legitimate democratic aspirations of those citizens, and not only from Tunisia? I mean, in other words, if the European Union has a real influence and power in those in the southern region. And the second question, one of these bilateral dialogues in human rights is between European Union and Cuba, or Spain and Cuba. Considering the release of the prisoners, political prisoners, and everything that is going on in Cuba, would you say that this dialogue is another of these fake examples that you mentioned, or it's a real and coherent dialogue?
Well, look, in terms of, will the Tunisian revolution spread? Will there be other Jasmine revolutions? There's been a lot written about this. I don't have a lot to add. I mean, Tunisia is different from the other countries you mentioned in that it did have a much more substantial middle class, a better educated population. In many ways, it was more ripe to overthrow a corrupt regime. So far, while there has been, sort of other self-immolations elsewhere, they have not led to the same spark that we saw in Tunisia. I do think that it's important, though, that the European Union and the US and others learn the lesson, and that is that it's wrong to sort of stand with the dictator simply because he's seen as a bulwark against terrorism or will help in fighting immigration. And you could say the same thing certainly about somebody like Mubarak in Egypt, where the U.S. in particular has continued to back him, even though the recently concluded parliamentary elections were far more repressive than the ones of 4 or 5 years ago. And it's important, I think, not simply to denounce that, as for example, the Obama administration did, but to also use the huge pressure that is available to it, including the massive U.S. aid to Egypt, to try to force Mubarak to be more respectful of the rights of Egyptians. And you could say the same thing about Algeria or other countries. With respect to Cuba, we obviously are heartened by the release of political prisoners. I think that of the promised 52 releases, there have been 41 who are actually free. There were 11 who remain in prison basically because they don't want to be released into exile. They want to be released into Cuba. And Human Rights Watch very much supports their right to be freed from prison and to stay in their country. I do congratulate the Spanish government on getting this far, but I think it's important to recognize that these releases, which are mostly from arrests, I think in 2003 or so, that this is really just the tip of the iceberg, that there are still scores of other people in prison for political reasons, often accused of dangerousness, but no real crime. And we shouldn't limit ourselves just to the 2003 political prisoners. And second, we should recognize that what needs to be dealt with are the structures, laws like the dangerous law that are used to keep the lid on any kind of dissent in Cuba. Now, one thing that we have been pushing Washington on, I mean, the Obama administration took a step forward by easing travel restrictions on Cuba, but he has not taken the next step we've urged, which is to try to substitute a genuinely multilateral form of pressure on Cuba for the very counterproductive US trade embargo. Now, he doesn't have it solely within his capacity to end the embargo. That requires congressional legislation. But what we have urged for a long time is that because the embargo has proven so counterproductive, because the Castro government seems to almost want it as a way to excuse its many economic failings, that the best way to genuinely promote human rights in Cuba would not be just with private dialogue. It would not be by simply sustaining the embargo, but rather would be substituting for the embargo genuinely multilateral pressure from a range of European governments and Latin American governments. And that kind of pressure, we think, could make an enormous difference on some of the structural problems beyond the release of particular prisoners.
Yeah, Maria Ramirez from El Mundo. Well, first, a follow-up on this question in Cuba. Then, do you think that it's a good idea to start a reinforced commercial and political cooperation with Cuba, as it's going to be discussed probably next month with the foreign ministers? And secondly, I would like to know, what do you think of the attitude of the EU in the case of the Western Sahara conflict, particularly in the incidents of November? And particularly the behavior of France and Spain, which are maybe the countries most involved in this issue. Thank you.
Well, in terms of Cuba, I mean, the proposal on the table, which is to simply resume normal relations with Cuba in return for nothing other than the release of prisoners, that would be an abdication of responsibility. What's needed is a policy of broad multilateral pressure on Cuba to deal with the foundation for the repression, the laws in place that continue to hold many political prisoners and continue to prevent the emergence of civil society and basic rights for most Cuban people. And so, we would favor a more effective strategy for change. We would not favor an abdication of pressure. In terms of Western Sahara, I mean, I think there's been a long tendency to simply, defer to Morocco there. There's been a tendency to treat Morocco with kid gloves. And, I think we saw the latest manifestation of this with the renewed strife in Western Sahara. Human Rights Watch does not take a position on the ultimate territorial resolution of Western Sahara, whether it should be independent or part of Morocco. We're always neutral on those kinds of questions. But we do believe that there should be an opportunity for the people of Western Sahara to fairly determine their future. And that those who, advocate independence, or for that matter, those who advocate ongoing, remaining part of Morocco, should have the freedom to debate these issues. And that is a freedom that Morocco has not allowed them, and that the European Union has seemed to acquiesce in.
Get to everybody.
Selçuk Gürtaş, Zaman, Turkey. Israel has just concluded this probe on the flotilla raid, and they found it legal. Your reaction to it, and U.S. position on the raid, please.
Well, I'm hardly surprised that the hand-picked Israeli investigative commission found everything okay. This was not an independent probe, and we have been pressing for a genuinely independent investigation of what happened with respect to the flotilla raid. And I should say that really is just one part of a broader problem. We similarly have wanted independent investigations into war crimes committed during the Israeli-Hamas conflict of 2008 and 2009. And while there has been some small progress on the Israeli part in bringing a few lower-level soldiers to justice, Israel has not looked at the commanders who gave the orders to, for example, use white phosphorus in heavily populated areas or engage in massive destruction of civilian infrastructure for purely retaliatory means. And Hamas, on its side, has not done anything on the accountability side. So we don't feel that there has been, at the national or local level, a genuine effort, a sincere effort, to investigate war crimes. The flotilla incident being just one part of a broader trend. We actually have not investigated the flotilla, so I can't offer my own view as to what happened. But clearly, this is something that merits an independent investigation.
Yes, Stefan Nieser, Tagesanzeiger. One question. First question: what about the credibility of the EU, seeing the discussion on the Hungarian media law, for example, or the latest judgment on the asylum policy in Greece to export those standards? And the second point is, I mean, you indicated a bit what you are saying. Isn't it, in a way, a global competition to lower standards between the US, the EU, and other players because of economic reasons, maybe, or the general crisis? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, in terms of Hungary, the new media law, in our view, is a clear threat to the right to free expression. And we hope that the EU shows itself capable of scrutinizing even the government holding the presidency. It's very unfortunate that Hungary assumed the presidency at the same moment as the new media law took effect. And we hope that we've urged Hungary to repeal the law, and we would urge the EU to put pressure on Hungary to end this threat to free expression. With respect to the European Court ruling on the sending of the asylum seeker back to Greece, I actually view that as a very positive step. I mean, it showed that European institutions worked in this sense. The court was absolutely right. No asylum seeker should be sent back to Greece. Greece right now has an utterly dysfunctional asylum system. Detainees, immigrants are mistreated in detention, and they have a minuscule prospect of having a fair assessment of their asylum claims. So, that should cause a reassessment of Dublin II. The European Union cannot pretend that the border states within the European Union have the capacity to fairly assess asylum claims just because they're members of the European Union. And so people should not be sent to places, even within the European Union, where a fair assessment of their asylum claims cannot take place. And the sending countries, whether it's Belgium or the UK, have a duty in those cases to provide a fair assessment themselves. In terms of the race to the bottom, I mean, yes, there is, when you have a competition for resources or for markets, of course you have the potential for a race to the bottom. I think the good news in this is that no government is willing to say, oh, we're just abandoning human rights because other things are more important. We need jobs, we need, markets. Instead, they say, we are promoting human rights. Look at our dialogue. And the good news in that is that there's too high a political price to admit that they're not doing anything. And so, what we're trying to accomplish today is to show that this ploy of referring to the dialogue is an empty ploy. The public shouldn't accept it. They should realize that is, for the most part, doing nothing. And they should insist on a human rights policy that actually does something.
Pascal Mallet, Agence France Presse. To go back to some principles in general, if I understand the thrust of your report is to mention that we are at a crossroad on the question of universality of human rights or not. Don't you think that this has been a fight that you have led for years? But the question is, as you mentioned, the power play is on, and the values, so-called universal values of the Western world, because it was born there, are more and more disputed elsewhere, and the trend is not very positive. What do you think of that?
First of all, there have always been challenges to the universality of human rights. Abusive governments, one of their first lines of defense is always to say, oh, these are, outside impositions, ignoring the fact that they're often enshrined in their own constitutions, ignoring the fact that their own people are asking for these rights. What has become different over the last couple of years is, first of all, that the balance of power in the world is shifting. And let me take a moment just to highlight some of the new emerging powers whose posture on these questions may ultimately determine whether the universality of human rights remains something we can talk about or not. And in this respect, I would highlight countries like Brazil, South Africa, or India. These are governments that are all democracies at home, but that have foreign policies that still reflect more a dictatorship. They all have a kind of a presumption against supporting efforts to enforce human rights. They all tend to view human rights as imperialist, rather than something that people around the world desire. And so, Human Rights Watch is putting a lot of stress these days on trying to encourage those governments to have foreign policies that better reflect the values by which they govern at home. And that if powerful governments like Brazil, India, and South Africa can gradually move into the reliably pro-human rights column, that will go a long way toward reinforcing efforts to promote the universality of human rights. That doesn't let the European Union or the United States off the hook, but it does recognize that power is shifting and that we need to look to a broader range of actors as we seek to defend human rights around the world.
Thank you. Inga Czerny from Polish Press Agency. I would like you to develop more your comments on Belarus, on European Union position towards Belarus. You said that European Union condemns strongly the repression, but still more than 1 month later after the election, after the violent crack of the oppositions, of the manifestation, we still have the sanction frozen, and decision maybe will be taken in the end of the month to restore the sanction, but still it's more than 1 month that's nothing has been decided. And do you think it was a good decision 2 years ago to restore the dialogue with Lukashenko?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at this stage, obviously the travel sanctions and the like, the suspension of those sanctions continues at this moment. And it is utterly inappropriate for that suspension to continue in light of the crackdown. And so the logical next step to match the rhetoric would be to apply pressure in the form of ending the suspension and reimposing the travel restrictions and the like. That is the kind of very targeted sanction that's perfectly appropriate. It aims at the people who are most responsible for the repression. And whether it was smart to try to ease Belarus toward a more democratic set of elections or not, one can debate that. But given that the elections were anything but fair and the crackdown has been intense, it's now time to end the suspension and to reinforce the sanctions. Oh, I mean, again, we don't oppose dialogue. But dialogue shouldn't be the only response. It's got to be dialogue combined with the kind of pressure that those sanctions represent.
Can you say something about, yes, Inga Kilian-Kainer, can you say something about the increasing violence against Christians and the situation of freedom of religion at all?
In any particular country or just around the world?
Egypt and Iraq.
Well, in Iraq, you say? Yeah, Iraq. Yeah, well, I mean, it's a source of serious concern in both places. I mean, in Iraq, it's taken a particularly deadly form with a series of quite brazen attacks. And this is the challenge to the government. The government has not, I think, provided this sort of vigorous response to try to, both condemn and to stop those kinds of attacks on Christians, which they warrant. In Egypt, there seems to be almost denial on the part of the Egyptian government that there are tensions between the Coptic Christian population and the Muslim population. And I see that the Mubarak government just today, blamed Palestinians for the most recent bombing, which, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's just all too convenient an explanation, because again, it would suggest that these are external forces that have nothing to do with growing tensions within Egypt. So, while the Egyptian government claims to be very committed to protecting the longstanding Christian population there doesn't seem to be the acknowledgement of tensions that would seem to be a prerequisite to attacking the problem at its root.
As people leave, if you could drop, there's a ball over there for your business cards. If you could, Vanessa.
All right, Marine Haas from Reuters. If you could pick up 2-3 countries where human rights have considerably degraded in 2010, which ones would be those countries? And second questions, at the time of economic crisis, relationships with China are crucial for many of the Western economy, and room for maneuver seems extremely thin. Which direction would you like to see a relationship with China, and which kind of pressure can we apply on that?
Okay, I mean, let me take the second one first, because to be honest, it's very hard to single out particular countries that have gotten worse. There have been countries that have been in greater turmoil. Burma trying to cleanse itself by having elections, but actually cracking down on the process. Congo, where there continue to be, very severe abuses in Eastern Congo, including sexual abuse and rape. You've got countries like Ethiopia, which hold elections and actually crack down more intensively in order to keep control. But it's hard for me to just single out, the worst three. I don't think I could do that. With respect to China, let me make 2 points, one about the EU, one about the US. With respect to the EU, one of the big points of debate right now is the arms embargo, which was imposed after Tiananmen Square. And Ashton, I think to her great discredit, is simply pushing to lift the embargo, when in fact, the embargo should provide an opportunity. It was imposed for a reason, because of a very violent crackdown. And the European Union should set forth in clear terms what criteria should be met in order for the embargo to be lifted. And we shouldn't, forget the reasons it was imposed in the first place. So there should be, some kind of open inquiry into what happened in Tiananmen. The prisoners from that era should be released. It should be possible to publicly mourn for those who died in Tiananmen Square and the surrounding areas. There are a number of things like that which go to the heart of the rationale for the sanctions, which we shouldn't forget about. And to say we're just going to lift the sanctions, which Ashton seems to be urging, is to squander this opportunity to actually accomplish something. Now, I know there's a tendency to feel, China's so powerful, how can we possibly put pressure on it? I was just in Washington last week and I actually was invited to the state dinner. And while, Obama has by no means been, great in China, he was a disaster during his visit to China a little over a year ago, where, he tried to be, quiet and friendly and looked weak and unprincipled. He kind of learned the lesson, and this time was much more outspoken and much tougher, at least at the rhetorical level, with China. And that didn't stop the dialogue. It didn't break relations between the two governments. I think that China recognizes that it has a serious human rights problem. It almost expects this to be part of its relations with other governments. It would prefer to, park that issue in the back room of the foreign ministry for the quiet dialogue. But the West should just say no. This should be not simply relegated to low-level foreign ministry diplomats. It should be a regular part of discussion for anybody who goes to China. At the presidential level, the prime ministerial level, the defense ministry level. This should just be a core part of the relationship with China on the part of every significant interlocutor.
Among democracies, which countries would you say that they are the worst human rights offenders? And and including India too. And my second question is that, have you ever urged the American government to cut subsidies to bad human rights offenders like Egypt, Jordan, etc.? Thank you.
Your first question I'm not going to answer, just because we don't get into this rating system. There are many democracies with serious problems. I'd be happy to describe them in any particular democracy, whether it's the United States or European countries or India, but I'm not going to do the rating thing. We just, as a matter of principle, don't do that. In terms of, do we urge that aid be cut or used as a lever to promote human rights? Yes, that's one of the regular tools that we invoke.
Hi, I'm Eva Doe from Reuters. I have a question about Tunisia. I was wondering what you thought about how long it's taking the EU to freeze the assets of Ben Ali, and what do you think the EU should do moving forward?
Well, yeah, obviously the assets should be frozen as quickly as possible, because assets can be moved very quickly. I think, in terms of going forward, first of all, it would be very appropriate for the EU to appoint a special troika to go immediately to Tunisia to demonstrate their support with the democratic aspirations of the Tunisian people and to help the new government. And this is where, governments like Poland or Romania, which have had their own experiences with overthrowing similarly repressive regimes, would be ideal leaders of a troika like that. So, again, this is the EU should not simply rely on Ashton or the new External Action Service, but it should use the strength of the diversity among its 27 to try to get things done. Within Tunisia, let me just highlight, broadly speaking, three things that I think need to be done. First is kind of ending the abuses of the Ben Ali period. So that means, releasing prisoners, changing laws, doing those sorts of remedial things. Second, there really does have to be a serious investigation into the violence that has taken place there. And third, I think it's essential that the new government respect human rights. And so we had an incident just over the last 24 hours where, one of the main TV stations was briefly shut down. We've had, reports of tear gas being used against demonstrators. I mean, it's absolutely essential that the new government live up to the standards that the Ben Ali government so systematically violated. And I would hope that the European Union could encourage those sorts of trends in what is still a very unstable situation. Thank you very much.